I think we're starting. I think we're starting. Hi, everyone. We're going to change owners of the deck to Matt Derby, and we're going to get started. Welcome. We're so delighted that you chose to spend your afternoon here with us. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues here at M&R, Matt Derby and Gwen Emmons, and Allyson Goldsmith from USA for UNHCR. And we're really excited to share some really fun and interesting work we've been doing over the past year or two on figuring out how to actually just get beyond personas and really use data and behavior to discover whole new things about audiences and how to use these insights. But first, just a little bit about M&R in case you don't already know. M&R is a consulting firm. We've been around for about 30 years. We're communicators and marketers and fundraisers and campaigners. And we see our role in the world is really just to help organizations and causes figure out how to just unleash the power of people to do good in the world around them. We work exclusively with nonprofits, so everything that we share is really relevant to group people in the nonprofit world. We're not sharing things that we learned from working with, lipstick or trucks or something like that. We're really looking at data that is around how people are engaging in causes and nonprofits. And we do lots of different things in order to do this. We do media relations and organizing and advocacy and fundraising and advertising and social media, basically any way that you're trying to reach somebody and inspire them, we do. But many people know us because we put out our benchmark study every year. This is our 15th year this year, and it is bigger and more exciting, I think, than ever before. It's coming on April 21st. It is our annual study of all of the metrics that really matter to tell us how we are actually reaching and inspiring people to give and act, and all the different channels that we're using to do that. And it looks at groups by sector in the nonprofit world, as well as by size. So you can really find how your organization is doing and where you should be aiming. So that's coming on April 21st. If you want to know any more about it, MrBenchmarks.com. I can tell you, I just read the draft and it's very exciting. Before we get going though, this is a session that is about people. And it's about why we're actually talking about why not personas. So we're going to start by doing a quick little exercise that I'll tell you about. And we're going to look at the lookalike landscape. Then we're going to show lots of stories and examples. The list that you can see. You are welcome to ask questions as we go along. We're going to be collecting questions. We might interrupt and ask a few questions of the panel. And we also will have plenty of time at the end to have a more in-depth question and answer with our panelists. And no question is too nitty gritty. No question is too big picture. We really hope that this can be a dynamic session today. So first things first, though, as I said, this is a session about people. And when we in our nonprofit world do, for a long time, we created these kinds of donor profiles. And, they might have put a picture to it, might have said sort of an age, where they live, what they're interested in. And a lot of us did that. And, they really helped us. For people who are responsible for writing or designing or creating, understanding who that person is that you're writing to can be really helpful to say, okay, this is who I'm writing to. But the other thing about it is that it can be really wrong or just not tell the whole picture. And even worse, on the next slide, do you like that subtle on the next slide? It just doesn't tell the whole picture. And when not telling the whole picture, we miss really important things. And at the worst, we also stereotype people. And that can lead to all kinds of bad things. The worst of all, sort of racism and sexism. And my favorite story about this is that I want to say it was in 2004, American Airlines came out with a website for women travelers. And I'm not kidding. It was all in pink and purple. So, that's not what any of us would do, but it leads to this kind of stereotyping. And so we are sort of been shifting a lot of our work to really thinking about who people are and how people just aren't their stereotypes. And we all behave in such unexpected ways. So there's lots of people in this webinar, too many to do individual introductions, but our guess is that all of you too are unique little snowflakes as well that don't fit the stereotype that might be out there or don't fit the demographics that might be on paper. So, and because it's also COVID and we all miss the chance to connect, we're going to still do introductions. We're just going to do them in small groups. Liz Thaler, our intrepid host who's managing all the tech, will break you into little groups automatically. We just have a couple of minutes to say hello and say where you're from and share just one of the probably many, many things about yourself, little unexpected or surprising. You only have about 3 minutes though, so don't dilly-dally. Liz, go ahead and break us all up real quick. It's happening. All right, folks. As everyone gets back, we're going to go ahead and switch in. But if you feel like it, feel free to share your unexpected facts in the chat, and we'll continue to get to know each other on the side. I'm going to pass it over to Matt Derby. Matt Derby is Senior Vice President here at M&R and is one of the leaders of our advertising practice area. So has been spending a lot of time on thinking about this stuff. Matt.
Thank you so much. Yeah, hello, hi everyone. And depending on what you celebrate, I hope you're having an excellent Passover, Maundy Thursday, April Fool's Day, or opening day. So we're gonna talk about some of the examples that Madeline shared, and I think like delivering a supporter intuitive direct response program, right, today shouldn't rely on gut instincts or staff opinions or stereotypes, especially when we have the ability to really use a combination of behavioral data and complex demographics to build reach among both known audiences and what might be under advertised to markets that really will deliver the best possible results. The approach of this is what our donor looks like and it's really monolithic. It's just it's not really sufficient. It's also problematic to treat audiences like they're the same, right? So that's not to say you shouldn't talk honestly about what people make up your donor list. You can look at demographics on your list and you can see trends and aspects of your list. It is likely that for a lot of organizations, a majority of your current donors are women who are older than 55 who live on the coasts, but that is not the entire picture. And the reality is that your donor file is a lot more varied. In fact, it's, this is like a representation, but it is like, it's right, your donor file is way more varied than any visual could possibly represent, especially given 2 dimensions. So right, this is not a new concept, right? The tech industry right now is especially the digital advertising industry is built around this idea that audiences are made up of complex but calculable data characteristics. So this is where we get the idea of lookalike audiences from, right? The way of looking at this approach has gotten better and better at audience modeling for building that audience. So you can see the basics of this approach, right? Facebook or Google will take a list of people, say your donor file, append a long list of complex traits to them, mostly based on information that people have submitted to those vendors, and they then give you a larger audience of prospects that look very similar to your input audience, and who will likely perform similarly to the existing audience. So there, in a nutshell, we have donor acquisition with data modeling, right? In particular, now we have it without spending a lot of money doing that ourselves. Facebook sort of funds this for you in exchange for advertising dollars. And this kind of self-serve data modeling in order to build audiences has been really essential to the growth of digital advertising, and particularly among nonprofits. We have seen that with our benchmarks report. And I think you can feel a lot of different ways about both Facebook's approach to data and nonprofits' use of Facebook. But I think one thing that we definitely see is, one, it does provide strong fundraising results as well as advocacy results, and 2, it is very accessible. So this is the increase year over year for the past 3 years in spending on advertising among nonprofits based on our benchmarks report. And as Madeline said, the upcoming report on 2020 is coming out in April, so this is a little preview of that number. We saw huge increases in advertising from 2017 to 2018, and while we haven't seen quite that same giant jump, we continue to see that grow in the double digits last year. And that trend holds up among organizations of all sizes, especially if you look at Facebook specifically. What we have taken are some specific examples of organizations where we have worked with them to take advantage of data and algorithms and advertising platforms like the Facebook lookalike audience that allows us to speak to complex audiences effectively, and that don't, as much as possible, fall into traps of relying on stereotyping or intuitive audience targeting or creative. So as much as possible using data to build that out. These are the 5, obviously, each of their examples is going to illustrate one of these points. So we'll go through them one by one. And Allyson Goldsmith, who is our colleague at USA for UNHCR, which is the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, is going to walk through the first example, which she implemented.
Thanks, Matt. So we're going to talk about how we use dynamic creative optimization, and that's a mouthful to say. So DCO is the acronym for that, and how we use that to tailor creative to audiences. But first, let's talk about some challenges with testing creative. It can be really challenging to test creative on Facebook or display because audience sizes or low response rates can make that really challenging to get like clean results. And also, for example, to preview just really quickly, we ended up creating 96 versions of our display ads to test, and I could not fathom the amount of time or the money that would go into building that many different display creatives if we couldn't use technology to automate that process. So one of the other advantages of DCO is that it's a much simpler and cheaper way to develop a lot of creative to test. So next, so with display, oh my gosh, it's hard to say. Dynamic creative optimization. This is an example of one of our display ads, and you can test the images, our logo and its colors, the ad copy, the call to action, the text color, the background colors. You can basically test every combination in this, which is really exciting because it gives us a lot of options for determining what the best creative is, but not just the best creative overall, the best creative for our different audiences. So next, Matt. So I mentioned that, for example, for our winter ads, we developed 96 variants between the copy and the colors and the images. And we had never even tested some of these colors before. So for example, the black ad was a new one for us, and so was the yellow. And so this gave us like a whole new world of creative that we could explore and see how people responded to. And basically what this does is it randomly rotates through the images and all of the different components to determine what the best creative is, but not just the best creative overall, the best creative for different audiences. So for example, this top one had the highest response rate overall. It's a mom holding a baby, but not everyone would necessarily respond to a mom and a baby. Like some people might be more drawn and more likely to respond to a child, which you can see in our other 2 top performing ads. So what this DCO helps us do is serve the right creative to the right person at the right time so that we can convince them to make a gift. And what this actually did is it increased our average performance by 3 times more than running just one version of these ads, which is really exciting because we learned a lot about what creative works with different audiences. And then we raised a lot more money to help refugees, which is our ultimate goal. So this had a lot of benefits. And one other benefit of dynamic creative optimization that I forgot to mention is we actually were able to run this creative for a lot longer before it fatigued because there's so many versions and variants that it's running through. People don't see the same ad constantly and start to not notice it. So that was a really unexpected but exciting benefit for me as well.
Yeah, and I know that actually, when we've talked about this before, one of the questions we've gotten is around what platforms we've used to run this. I think this example, I don't know, Allyson, if you actually remember.
It's that specific example, those are both from Zeta, but we can do this with other display vendors. And then we use a tool that does something similar with Facebook as well.
Yeah.
Allyson and Matt, we've got a couple questions in the audience. One is, how long do you run before the ads fatigue?
That's a really great question. So that Syria DCO example that we showed first, we've been running that for about a year because sadly there is still a crisis in Syria. And we haven't seen the creative performance drop. And that one I think actually has, from what I can remember, I'm pretty sure that has more variance than the winter one, which was 96. And that's not the only ads we run. Like we're also running Yemen display ads, and we're sort of at the tail end of winter. So it's not our only creative, but that I think our average creative lifespan is about 2 or 3 months for an ad that isn't in DCO. And so it really does like extend it out quite a bit.
And what's the specific metrics that you might be using for assessing fatigue? Is it, clicks? Is it donations? What's your metric?
We're using annualized ROI.
Yeah.
We have really high acquisition goals set for us. So our display program is really focused on acquisition. So we primarily are looking at basically our return on our ad spend. And because we're monthly first, we look at it on an annualized basis. And we do look occasionally at like clicks and those metrics as well, but we're really driven by that annualized ROI based on our program goals.
And this seems like a good time also just to mention, Allyson, when we looked at a set of ads that all showed kids and people in them. And one thing I think like it goes without saying, like we've been doing these experiments for some time now, but it goes without saying that I think Allyson and USA for UNHCR, like many organizations, is really reassessing how we think about creative. And I did want to give one more plug to the work that you're doing, I know, Allyson, internally around that. And also just we at M&R created a guide to ethical and effective creative. I'll put it in the chat if you want to link up. There it is in the chat. I thought that was a good time to mention that. Rachel Feinberg asked if you recommend implementing, dynamic creative optimizations during a major campaign.
If it's a campaign that is really important to your organization or that you're running for a long time, I definitely recommend it. We've chosen Syria as a crisis that we never really see people like lose interest in. So that's a good one for us. Yemen would be another, but like I wouldn't necessarily think about it for like something that's going to be short-term, like a short-term crisis. Like we're responding right now to the fires that happened in the Rohingya refugee camps, but I expect that to be more of like a short-term emergency. So I think this is really good for a long-term emergency because it took us about 3 or 4 months to get the testing results from our winter ads the first time we ran them. So I think you need to have that amount of runway, and obviously depending on your spend, you might get results faster or slower. So I would say for campaigns that are not going to be really short, it's a really awesome option.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good point, Allyson. Like one of the challenges of some of this work is that it takes a little bit more time to set up initially. So there is some initial investment that's required. And, algorithms and optimizations tend to take time to learn. So there's also, they don't necessarily get off and running at the best pace, but it takes conversions over time to get them to where you want.
Yeah, Jeff made a comment in the chat about that relates to that, Matt, and Allyson, you might have seen like that, if it's reaching significant before it starts to optimize and serving sort of the early winning elements, you create that snowball effect. And sometimes you don't actually know exactly what the isolated element is, but in some respects, if you're continuing to do it over time, you start to see some trends across campaigns versus some things might get blurry in the individual campaign, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's other questions, but that actually
Nice
is a great
segue.
lead in to the next section, which is right, like one of the things that can be really easy is relying on just the sort of like initial winning algorithm and sort of running with it. You know, something that we've learned over time is that you know, something seems obvious, and right, like taking a lookalike of your donor file is going to find people who are good donors. But what I consistently find, not just when dealing with data, but in all aspects of both my work and life, is sometimes what I expect to be true or is intuitive is wrong. And that is definitely true when we were working with complex stuff. So, right, like if you tend to lean on a single input, there's always a danger, right? Like if you put in an input audience or a donor audience that is not very diverse, what you're going to get back from a lookalike audience is also something that's not very diverse. And algorithms are going to tend to optimize to the most common denominator. You know, and that can become both a problematic, both in terms of performance, but also in you know, in terms of bigger picture ethical goals. So, you know, one of the things that we have to make sure to do is consistently test and challenge the algorithms so that they're not just running on their own. You're not completely relying on them. You're continually trying new things for creative. You know, that can mean adding in new creative types that are very different directions, giving them the time to compete with your best performers. And for audiences, that can mean taking different inputs and creating new targeting from them. So we work with UNHCR with Allyson in the USA, but we also work with them in Canada. And UNHCR operates, right, a number of different country offices around the world. In case you are a geography major, this is Sweden, Canada, and Australia. I got very nervous for a while that I was actually going to put like Argentina in here and call it Sweden. But one of the things we started doing is testing different combinations of input donors for our lookalikes. And we've seen some results, right, that are surprising just by forcing ourselves to test things that we wouldn't necessarily try if we were relying entirely on intuition. So, so one of the things we did was we took donors, a donor list from all three countries, compared them against each other, and compared them against a combination of all of them. Because, right, it's you would expect that a lookalike of Canadian donors would perform the best in Canada, and you wouldn't really be wrong. When we just looked at the individual country lookalikes, what we have seen, right, is that Canadian lookalikes consistently outperform other countries. But when we first started running this, we found that a combined lookalike of donors from all three countries outperformed even the Canadian one. This isn't always the case. So we do, we occasionally refresh this, and sometimes this does not work, right? Sometimes adding more a larger input audience can sometimes maybe muddy the waters. You don't get as, you know, distinct characteristics. It can just look like a sort of all people lookalike. But I think what we have consistently found, right, is one, it's important to test your assumptions and just let the data figure it out on its own. And two, what's really important is that when we looked at the audience overlap between the lookalikes that we were normally targeting with the new one that we created, there was over 2/3 of the new lookalike who were brand new to us, and we wouldn't have targeted if we had been sticking with our original strategy, which again, the original strategy didn't perform badly. But we were able to open up that audience based on some simple iteration. And this doesn't, right? I think in some cases you don't have to outthink yourself on it. I know Allyson was talking about recently, right? They will do a whole list of different lookalikes. I actually took a look, right? This is, you know, around one new lookalike audience every month. And you can see some of them are a combination of super major mid-level or sustainers. Their type, their donor type. Some of them are people who gave on certain days, like they responded to end of year, or they responded to a Syria appeal. So it doesn't have to be demographic, like country of origin. It could be behavioral. It doesn't even. It could be. Sometimes we try lookalikes, for instance, that aren't even donation based. A lookalike of, for instance, people who have watched your videos on Facebook. So you can both target the people who are watching the videos as well as a lookalike of people who watch the videos. And so again, I think it's around, again, trying to challenge the algorithms, not let them do all the work for you. Try to make sure that they're iterating and evaluating that based on what works. And that is how you're going to find new audiences that you weren't necessarily finding if you just relied on the simple one.
Matt, Sandra has a question about how you determine the clusters. And I know you've talked a little bit about that, but maybe just a bit more detail about how we determine clusters, which I know is different for different organizations, but.
Sure. So yes. So that is an excellent question. A little bit of a preview is that you can see the clusters in here, and that's actually the next example that I'll share about how to do that.
See, if you ask a question, we'll give you an example right there.
Yeah, so one of the things that's really important for us is acquiring new donors, but also acquiring a diverse set of new donors. And so that's where we looked into and did this a demographic cluster analysis in partnership with M&R. And basically, when we think about our donor files and we upload them as like one giant group, I think we miss out on different and smaller sub pockets of our group that we wouldn't necessarily think about. And so cluster analyses can help find the different subgroups that, right? So Matt is doing a better job of explaining this with pictures. So basically, it helps find groups of donors who look similar to each other that we wouldn't necessarily see when we're looking at the huge monolith of data. And actually, as just a thought for this, our whole donor file actually doesn't work as a lookalike model for us, and my hypothesis on that is that it's actually too big and it's too confusing for Facebook, and it can't figure out how to model it. So we found that these smaller inputs actually work better. And so just in case you are in a similar place and haven't found lookalikes that work for you, this is another way to think about it. But anyways, so back to clusters. So your cluster analysis takes your whole donor file, which looks like lots and lots of different people, and it scores them and finds groups that are similar to each other. And what you upload into this cluster analysis can be a little bit different. The first one we did demographics only. And so we get our demographic information from the voter file. So that's people self-reporting their demographic information, which we think makes it pretty accurate. And what it did is it spit out 9 different clusters for us. And so this is an example of one of our clusters. And what you can see here is this group is more likely to be African-American, and they're more likely to be evangelical and Protestant. But there's also a small group of people in here that are over-indexing for being Muslim as well. And then it also indexes higher for being younger and for having a household income between 75 and 99,000, and they're less likely to be married, Catholic, or a homeowner. And our general audience is our general file is women who are 65 plus. And so this audience looks really different than that, which is what we were going for. So then we took these clusters. Go ahead.
Allyson, I was just gonna, just from the question that I know we got last time was, right, did you use a program for this? How do I put my file into Excel, hit the cluster analysis button?
Oh my God, I wish you could do that. So we worked with a data analyst at M&R to do this the first time. And then we have a data analytics team at USA for UNHCR. We're really lucky in that. And so when we did our second cluster analysis, we worked with them And for our second analysis, we actually also uploaded their donor behavior because we were curious to see how that would change the clusters that it populated.
Yeah, and one of the things that our data team taught me that I didn't realize is that cluster analysis is like a phrase that actually applies to a lot of different types of statistical analysis, and which one you choose depends on what you're getting towards, right? We were trying to find groups of individual data points that were similar to each other, and that's one type. But if you're trying to find, for example, individual data types who all seem like another set group, that's actually different. Or a group that all has one characteristic in common is different than if you're trying to find groups that have many characteristics in common. So because I don't understand the math that I need to in order to explain it, like we're not going to necessarily get into all the details, but I think that's probably as much as you need to go to the data analysis person on your team and ask for help with that.
Yes, I can also talk more about the voter file. So we actually pay into being able to have access to the voter file through our data analytics team. And so I don't know exactly how they do that. I think we partner with Civis to do that. I just know that we do it. But I also know that there's other ways to get demographic information if you don't have access to the voter file. So did that answer your question a little bit at least?
I was just going to repeat the question that Beth asked, and her question was, can you talk a little further about matching donor files? Love to do cluster analysis when logistic regression modeling with our donor file. But Beth says, yes, you answered her question. So good job. Can I also ask just there's many places where we could ask this question, but Peter asked about what privacy concerns you have about uploading donor lists to Facebook or Google. And I think for lots of really good reasons, we all have a lot of nervousness about that. Not just you, Peter.
Matt, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for that. Yes, I do have privacy concerns about sharing these with any group, whether it's Facebook or Google or with, LiveRamp is one of the lesser known companies that does matching of information to people to a cookie pool that allows you to also then show those people ads. I think that there is a degree of trust that you have to end up having in order to use those platforms. I don't think that trust is always warranted. We do try to make, I think the most important thing is for your organization and whoever you're partnering with it to have an open and honest conversation about what you're actually doing and what you're actually sharing versus not. For instance, one of the things that we've often talked to our organizations about not doing is you can do something called email hashing, which involves sharing email addresses that get submitted on your website through the URL to a vendor partner. Facebook does this, and while that is just a checkbox that you can click on the form when you're setting up Facebook ads, I actually think that that's a much bigger decision around sharing that data publicly, even though it's hashed, versus through a private API. I think those are difficult. Where you draw the line is a very complex question. I think but I think the most important step is to make sure that you're having a conversation and choosing to draw a line at some point.
Yeah.
Let's keep going.
Cool.
So, Allyson, what did you do with the clusters once you had them?
So we uploaded our clusters to Facebook, and then we built lookalike models off of them. And what's really exciting is that these found both new donors, so there wasn't a lot of overlap between the audiences we were already prospecting to, but then they also had positive or annualized return on investments, or annualized return on our ad spends, which was also really exciting to us because that's one of our big goals is positive annualized ROASs for acquisition. So that was really exciting to us. Next map. And then the other thing that was really interesting is we were curious if creative performed differently between the different clusters and our general prospecting audiences. And what we noticed is that cluster 4 actually had creative that performed very differently. And so cluster 4 were more likely to be parents, and they were family oriented. And we actually saw that ad creative that focused on children and families actually performed much better when these are our bottom performing variants in every other ad or in every other audience. So that was really interesting for us. And so what we think was happening here is we were talking to the identity of the people that were in that cluster, which is really important. And we were able to actually optimize into this creative just for this audience, as opposed to all of our other ones. So that led to better response rates as well. And I think that this just goes to show that people perform really differently. And it's not just about finding your top variant, it's about finding the best creative for that audience. And without looking at all of our creative by the different audiences, if we had just looked at performance overall, we probably wouldn't have had success with this audience, and B, we wouldn't have found that they perform differently and they respond to different creative. And so that's been really interesting for us, especially as we think about continuing to diversify our acquisition to different audiences.
Yeah. Gwen is actually going to go further into that idea of finding the right creative and matching it into audiences. But I did want to tell a quick story from Oxfam, because one of the things that we've often found is that it doesn't, you don't need to rely on, that was a story about, like Allyson said, mostly demographic traits. Whereas, you don't have to have those. I think for some reason, for various reasons, organizations don't always have or want to use demographics. And like Allyson said, a lot of times actually modeling based on behavior rather than a trait that's appended to a file can be a lot better predicting the predictor of performance. So for Oxfam, they had a history of doing a mid-level campaign, right? So trying to get people into, and I'm really sorry, I actually don't know what their mid-level range is. So if you ask me about the definition of mid-level, I'm not going to have an answer for you. So they trying to recruit people, existing donors, to become mid-level donors. And for a long time, they've relied on a simple wealth screen in order to identify the most likely people to convert. Using that kind of data, I don't think it's bad, but more and more we are finding it again, a simple one-step data is not going to give you either the reach or the depth that doing an algorithmic analysis like cluster analysis can get you, which would mean you're leaving money on the table, right? So when looking at just a wealth screen to identify prospective mid-level donors, compared to a model of donor based on recency, frequency, monetary value data, highest previous contribution, but all of those weighted together, we continue to sort of refine that approach based on which segments of the expanded pool made gifts. That gave us a lot, both more and higher quality audiences than what we had been using before. So 2 times the audience size compared to when it was just built from wealth scoring, and we ended up at the end of the campaign seeing 7 times more conversions than previous campaigns. So again, deeper and richer. And again, like what we saw from what Allyson was talking about, was that messaging that matches the audience matters a lot. So adding in an additional step of communication stream for mid-level donors these are people who are already very familiar with your work, right? They don't need the attention-grabbing creative that that usually someone who maybe doesn't know your brand, they already have an affinity for your brand. So what they want is a deeper understanding of where their gift is going, including messaging that doesn't actually have a donation ask, increase their response to giving. And in fact, right, when we then added in those additional asks, which were not donation asks in the ads, we saw a 5.5 time return on ad spend. So about a $4.50 ROAS if we're comparing to the previous slides, without even featuring that ask. So again, having both using that data to build that model, as well as having creative that's developed specifically for that audience, is really important. And Gwen is going to talk a little bit about how we can go even further in making sure that we're matching that creative.
Yeah, so what we've seen so far today is that different segments of an organization's file tend to respond to really different kinds of creative. Now, if we go to the next slide, the question then becomes for me, how can we better understand what creative segments are gravitating towards without pouring a lot of money, or to Allison's point about the time it takes to optimize things, about waiting for a couple of months to actually understand what creative concepts are working or not working. So last summer, we partnered with an organization to figure that out, following the process that you are now familiar with that Matt and Allyson has sort of very nicely teed up for me. The difference here is that we also used a pre-market testing tool to vet our creative before we ran it. So we started by using our hidden markets algorithm, if we go to the next slide, to uncover hidden clusters of the organization's sustainers who were different from their average sustainer profile, which tended to be older retirees with a higher level of disposable income. And what we found is four clusters like this one right here, young families, that were smaller in size than their average cluster, but they showed enormous giving potential, but they just weren't being tapped or activated at a very high rate. The challenge with these clusters was we knew a little bit about them from the demographic data on file, but we really didn't understand, what do these people care about? Why do they support this organization? It was pretty easy to make a lot of assumptions. I could rattle off 12 assumptions right now about young families, but we didn't really have any answers or data to back up those assumptions. So we developed a couple of creative concepts like this one that were designed to test a couple of intentional hypotheses about each cluster. For example, do these clusters respond well to images of children and young families, or do they respond to more threatening images like this concept right here with the wildfire that is intentionally scary and a little terrifying?
I didn't get the animation on that. I'm sorry, Clay.
That's cool. That's cool. We also tested several cases for giving, with the goal being to find the right combination of imagery and case for giving that was going to effectively motivate each cluster. And if we go to the next slide, you can see examples. An identity-driven one, institutional, logistical, these are all probably themes that you were familiar with in your own direct response copywriting. So we had about 9 pieces of creative or so that we were going to put together. The next goal was try to figure out which cluster responded to which piece of creative. And to do that, we used Swayable, which is a closed creative testing platform that allows us to get some feedback on sample creative, as well as critically assess which creatives are actually going to increase an individual's likelihood to support the organization by making a sustaining gift. Sandra, I saw you had a question in here about psychographics. We haven't yet tested psychographics. I would be tickled to do that. And I think Swayable would be a great way to do that. So be able to understand what people's values are. And then with Swayable, you can sort of filter out how people respond to which creatives based on their values. So if you look here, if you've been listening for the past hour or so, you're probably not going to be that surprised to know that each cluster responded to slightly different creative. We found that women who volunteered with the organization in the past wanted to see really positive, uplifting stories of people the organization helped. Military families, which was another cluster, wanted to hear about how easy it was to make a monthly gift, but they also responded pretty strongly to messaging that spoke to their sense of duty and desire to defend people in need. So we came out of that knowing a little bit about what was working, what's not. Using those findings, we were able to revise the most effective creative based on the feedback we got. We made a couple of new concepts and then launched those concepts to some lookalike audiences, like Matt and Allyson have been talking about, of those organization clusters. Over a 4-week period, we found that we were able to recruit donors at a much higher return on ad spend, with sustainers making about 17% of all the annualized revenue that we got. I would also say here, like, I am very proud and very excited about these numbers, but we only ran this over 4 weeks. And I think if we had run that a little bit longer, we would actually see these numbers grow even more as we got a better understanding of what each cluster liked and had a chance to throw in some more creative optimizations.
Great. Gwen, I know I had this, someone asked me this question recently, and I didn't actually know the answer. Do you know how Swayable gets people into the closed testing groups?
Yeah, so I believe they recruit them through like a Mechanical Turk, a couple tactics like that. So people are recruited to take a survey for a set amount of money, so people get some compensation for their time. They take a battery of questions before they view your creative, everything from how old are you to specific questions like, have you heard of your organization name here? Then they view the creative and then they answer those questions again. They don't answer some of the demographic ones because your age shouldn't change after you see the creative. But we're really curious about what is your opinion of the organization and how does that shift after you see this piece of creative? My hope is it gets better. But yeah, they're primarily recruited through tactics like Mechanical Turk to find people.
It's important to note that in Swayable, like a lot of these other things, this is really a lot of it is reporting what people are saying in that moment, not necessarily what they're doing. It's a valuable piece. It's not the only piece. Obviously, what people do is the real truth and the real thing that we seek, but it really does. Gwen, can you say, like, have you seen those, the opinions like that you see found in Swayable, for example, play out in performance?
Yeah, yes and no. I think you're absolutely right. Swayable is instructive. It can help you save time and resources. But what people say they like is different, especially when we're talking about money, right? Like people may say they really like this creative of a puppy, but the creative that's going to make them donate is one with a bright red countdown clock on it. We see that often. That being said, I would say for most of the time when I'm running tests with clients, whether it's around fundraising, around intention to vote, around intention to take action, generally we see a correlation between what is bubbling to the top in Swayable and what people actually respond to through ads. But I always have that in the back of my mind, like, let's see what actually happens here when we actually put it out there in the world.
It's all we all care about in many respects is what actually happens, but we try to make as much sense of it as we can. Beth asked about the clusters that you're talking about, Gwen. Are you referring to what clusters? The clusters that you were referring to are based on the same voter file data match or another source?
That's a great question. So this organization did not have voter file data. They had a pretty robust data warehouse. It was honestly an overwhelming amount of data where we had to actually cut down some of the data sources to reduce some of the noise. But they had done a really great job over the years of collecting and appending information about their donors, as well as just like who's opening and clicking emails, who's responding to what campaign. So for this cluster analysis, we just relied on the data that they had because it was pretty robust.
All right, we're going to move to our panel discussion. We're going to stop the slides. This is your chance to really ask questions. I will definitely ask some questions of our panelists. And just to reintroduce, just from Allyson Goldsmith from USA for UNHCR, former M&R alum. Gwen Emmons, by the way, is our creative director here at M&R. She specializes in ads, but also in all kinds of things as well. And I think I mentioned before that Matt is a senior vice president with our ads practice area. And I'm Madeline Stanionis. I realize I never introduced myself. I'm a partner here at M&R and get to put my thumb into a lot of things, including the work that everyone's describing here. So we have questions. So I think like the first question is, it's like, if you're an organization, what's the first step? Like if you haven't done this kind of work yet, what's the first step?
I guess I can take this. So I think the first step is to decide if you want to focus on creative testing or audience testing first. And I know that, and we did this over a period of time, so we did not do this all at once. And I think then once you've picked that, there's ways to start with simple things. So like the first audience testing we did was not the cluster analysis. Like we started with lookalike models, and we tested like a lookalike of our whole donor file and like a lookalike of our sustainers and some of the more like basic lookalike modeling that Facebook can do. And then from there, as our acquisition program grew, then we started investing in other things and more AI, especially on the creative testing side, so that we could continue to expand the program. So I would say like, don't feel overwhelmed. Like you don't have to do all of this in like one day. And we did it over like lots of iterations.
So any other things to add to that, Matt or Gwen? We have some other questions to jump to.
No, I think that's right. I think also choosing the platforms that have made it really easy. Again, I know we all have, again, there are concerns about Facebook, but they do make it really easy to use their platform and to use that to find sub audiences that you should be probably speaking to and speaking to differently.
And
my video keeps.
Oh, sorry, Madeline.
Go ahead, Allyson. No, go ahead. Keep going, Allyson.
I was just gonna say, we've used Facebook as like the starting place for a lot of our testing. And then if something works really well on Facebook, we've expanded it out to testing on other channels, because Facebook is often a little bit easier or faster to get results from. So that's another thing like to consider when you're building your testing plans, is you don't have to run it in the same place all at once either.
I was gonna say my video keeps freezing active faces, so I keep having to turn it off. Sorry about that. I want to shift to a question that Ilana had about engines. So what are your thoughts on, if any, on using wealth engines analysis? And some people are using, by the way, through Salsa CRM, and they use capacity and propensity in the wealth screening process. And have we used it in a way that could be helpful?
I don't know that I don't actually know that we've used it in any of our work. I think though, what I would say is, again, what I've generally found is not that any well screen doesn't work. It's just like the more information that you have, and especially if that information is based on that user's interaction with your organization, that really helps to supplement what else you have, right, from any sort of third-party data source. So that first party data, which is how many times has that donor given to you specifically? What's the last time they did that? How much did they give to you? Their frequency of giving, I think, has tended to be really valuable addition to any third-party screen.
And I think we've seen, a lot of us have seen a lot of fundraisers everywhere. I've seen like the wealth screening engines really work for mid-level giving and other levels of giving. And I have not personally seen them work as well for entry-level donors. And we all know as fundraisers that wealth isn't often a very good indicator of when somebody's going to make a $25 a month gift or a $50 gift in an emergency. Or wealth is often not as important for these mass donors that we're really looking at, but it doesn't mean it couldn't be.
I would say that's the one thing that I'm always willing to try something, but that's the one thing that gives me pause is I often find tools like Wealth Engine really great for mid-level or high-level donors, and there's certainly value in recruiting more of those folks to the fold. But they can tend to devalue some of the smaller dollar donors, which to the point that we've been talking about can often mean you're creating this echo chamber of recruiting the same kinds of donors over and over and ignoring the younger donors of color, folks who have lower economic means, but still want to give and develop a meaningful relationship with you.
For folks who have done some of this kind of cluster analysis or really sort of any of some of the strategies and tactics we've talked about today, if you could share in the chat just some of the things that you've learned, and then I'll amplify some of those. Meanwhile, one question I have for this group is, one of the things that impressed me the most when I first saw the work that we were doing in this is that we were looking at people who fell into a particular religious group or a particular demographic group like parents or a particular ethnicity. And one of the things that was really impressed upon me is when you took the creative was that you started with the creative that works great for your cause. And instead of starting with, okay, we're going to go ahead and make creative that we think parents want, African-American religious folks want, or that like you, and I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit about how you approach creative in those moments.
Yeah, so we think most about like, what are we seeing work in general, and then see how it does with all of our audiences. And we do have goals. So acquiring Muslim donors is a really big goal of ours. Ramadan is our second biggest campaign of the year, and it's something we've really invested in. And the reason that we've invested in that is actually because a large chunk of the world's refugees are Muslims and celebrate Ramadan. So, and then I think that there's that tie. So it sort of makes sense for us organizationally. And what I think really interesting is that often what we think will happen with the creative is not the way people actually respond to it. And so I think one thing that's been really interesting over the years for me is Yemen and how people respond to that. And when I first started at USA for UNHCR, I suggested that we run a Yemen campaign, and everyone was like, well, Yemen's never raised any money for us. So like, no. But it's actually been our top performer for over a year and a half now, pretty much nonstop. When it declined a little bit during winter, because that's more of a seasonal holiday, or a seasonal event. And I think what we've really seen with that is that younger audiences are responding really well to Yemen. And we're not entirely sure why that is. But I think that that's been something that's been really interesting to us. And it doesn't mean that we like only create Yemen creative that we think younger people will like, but it is something that we keep in mind. Like we've been looking at, for example, with Canada, like Instagram, like creative that looks like things that people are posting organically on Instagram. And we tested this ad that sort of has that like graphic feel, and it like flips through slides instead of like our standard video creative. And it actually performed really, really well. It was our top performer for a long time. So, and that engaged younger audiences really well. So we're starting to think about, like, we're not like wildly shifting, but we are starting to think about like the platforms and where we're serving the creative, and creative that looks like what people are seeing on that platform. And that way it's not, and I think that way it's not like instantly like that's an ad. It's like people are engaging with the content, and then they feel like connected to it, or they want to help. And then we're saying like, and here's how you can do that. And so I think that's like why we're seeing some of that creative work better for different audiences. But I think that it's really important to not stereotype these audiences. So like we would never say like, well, we think Muslims care about this more, so we're only going to run that creative to them. And so I do think it's really important to keep this like really data driven, and to think about like what's working overall, and then let those people optimize into like what they want to see, or the people that fall into that audience optimize into like what's really working for them. Because I will say it is often not the ad that I would have guessed. And I think that that's really important. And it's a good it's like a good reality check for like, we are not always our audience. And so what I like is not necessarily what people are going to respond to. And we're also trying to do all of this while keeping in mind that like ethical creative ideas that we've all been talking about. And so, I guess, no, maybe not everyone, but like our organization and M&R has been talking a lot about. So also making sure that we're not showing refugees in undignified situations, or stereotyping our audiences, because that's not really ethical either. So there's a lot of tightropes to walk here, and we're trying to make sure that we do all of that in a really ethical way.
I think Allyson makes
my guess is
really...
lots of folks on this call are on the same, and Gwen, I'll come to you. Just two resources that you might want to check out: community-centric fundraising and Nonprofit AF, who are also talking about this quite a bit and really influencing so much of our work. Gwen, to you.
I was gonna say, I think Allyson, I want to just give an enthusiastic +1 to everything that Allyson said. I mean, to me, if we are serious about developing ethical creative that like best represents our values, that does mean leaving our assumptions at the door. And I think Madeline, you had a great point of like, just start with your best performing creative and let it build from there. Don't try to Frankenstein something based on assumptions and stereotypes. To me, that I think that's the real promise of these creative testing tools, is it allows real people, not stereotypes, to guide our work. And I think that's one way we can make our creative more effective. The other thing that you can do is just look at what folks on your list are responding to on that cluster, or even just set up a focus group of donors on your file and get their input on what you're making and what their reactions are to it.
I've got a couple other questions in here, just switching gears a little bit. The one question is, what do client budgets need to typically look like in order to pull off this kind of testing?
It's a good question. I will say that from what I call it, the actual work of creating clusters is not super expensive, and in terms of that cost. And again, like Allyson said, a lot of organizations can do it themselves in-house with with a data team or a person. I do think the question probably becomes, right, like, do you have the budget to be running for in multiple audiences over multiple months? And I don't know that there's necessarily one answer, because it's really like you could probably spend you can easily spend a lot of money, but even if you're spending a little bit of money, if you have the patience to have it run over time, that still works. So it really depends on what the sort of time frame you're talking about is. And I do think it's again, not the first place I would start is cluster analysis. I think if you're not already running a lot of different lookalikes, then you should probably start there, because it's just easier and more straightforward. But once you're at that place where you feel like you've really hit the limit of lookalikes, that's probably where I would start.
You also don't have to run every audience all at once. So like we didn't, in our first cluster analysis we did with M&R, we had 9, and we did not launch all 9 at once. We like sort of staggered them out. So that's another thing that you can do when you're looking at your budgets, if you create a lot of clusters like we did, or if you don't have the budget to run them all at once.
My guess is that some of the folks on this call are data folks inside organizations, and some of you aren't. Some of you are more the content side. And a good suggestion from Hiro Suzuki here on the call: if your org has a data team in-house, I highly recommend using the mclust package in R. This is what I use to conduct my cluster analysis. The truth is, if you have an in-person data person, really of any sort of level, this is not impossible to do. This is something that if you just copied and pasted Hiro's suggestion, that would be going a long way. So the neat thing about this is that if you haven't done it, it sounds like completely mysterious, but for folks who are got their hands in the data on a regular basis, this is a thing people think about. So it's really pretty accessible. I want to open it up to more questions. Are there other questions that folks have? We always give we always make our roundtables more than an hour long, because an hour is too short, but we always know that they likely won't go to the full hour and a half. We just like to give a lot of wiggle room here. So I would want to encourage anybody who has any other questions or comments, or I can relate to that statements, or anything like that. Any questions? And then also to our panelists, are there things that you want to add to this discussion that you haven't had a chance to say yet or share? Fun anecdotes, interesting observations. What does when I participate in the CDO, the creative dynamic optimization just looks like a long list. It's pretty not magic. That's always surprised me. Anything surprises you how easy it is to do once you get in there?
I would say another like added benefit. So we use something similar to CDO on Facebook. And when the pandemic started, we were actually having to cycle our Facebook creative about once a week, because people were spending so much time on Facebook that we would see these like massive spikes and then like sharp drops. And we implemented a tool that sort of rotates through our ad creative, and that made our ads last like almost a month instead of 1 week, which was a huge relief for me because that was a huge amount of creative to try to be like launching every week. So I would say like what we were looking for was to help determine what creative was working, but the added benefit is that it actually like cycles through so much that you can run things for longer. So that was just like a fun side effect to that for me. But I would say like just don't be intimidated by any of this, and you can start small and build from there.
Matt and Gwen, anything else to add?
I will say, as a relatively impatient person, I am like always like pleasantly surprised at how quickly the creative testing part is. I am used to the old days of launching a whole bunch of things and waiting for a couple weeks for the algorithm to do its thing, and then hope that the algorithm hasn't completely like muddied the waters. But with creative testing tools, we can often get results back in like 24, 48 hours, sometimes even sooner. Which I think makes it really helpful to make a data-informed decision quickly, rather than just waiting for weeks and weeks for the algorithm to magically give you some numbers back.
Matt?
If I was going to name something I was surprised by, I think it's how much the industry is actually still working on optimizing this stuff. It's like, I think for a while when we were starting to do this, we sort of expected when I would reach out to vendors about dynamic creative optimization, I'd be like, oh yeah, this has been something we do for years. And really they're still figuring out the best ways to implement it. So I think, tools like Swayable and tools like DCO are new, and that's not just true for nonprofits, that's true for everybody. And I think they're going to continue to evolve, and they're going to continue to probably get better, hopefully get better. That's been surprising to me.
Mm-hmm. It's a pretty exciting time to be in this business, and these new things that are occurring and that anybody can get into them pretty easily is really exciting time. A couple resources. I have one more question just to confirm from Ilona. Facebook, Instagram lead ads allow you to A/B test something like 6 or 8 images. Isn't that sufficient for this, or do you think organizations need to invest in a secondary service to get this right?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. The A/B testing tool, great. And often for many organizations, like that's cost effective, do it. I think the advantage of using an outside platform is 2 things. One, you sort of remove the weird influence of the algorithm. You're just looking at people's responses with no fluff. The other thing that external tools can allow you to do is understand more questions. So with Facebook A/B test, you're really understanding which one gets more people to click this link or donate. Like you have one question you're trying to answer. For the test I was showing earlier today, we were actually trying to figure out 2 things. One, which creative creates a brand lift, more positive favorability ratings for the organization, and which one is more likely to make somebody make a sustaining gift. So I think the ability to sort of get more bang for your buck and answer more questions with one round of testing, to me is music to my little nerd ears. But again, like using the A/B testing tool in Facebook also gives you a lot of really useful insights. And again, I am on team, like as many insights as you can gather, like it's just going to make your creative better.
Amanda, Matt, did you want to add?
Yeah, I do see Amanda's question about Facebook ads. Yeah, if you rely on reporting in Facebook platform, you don't get things.
Matt, I'm just going to repeat the question just in case. Let's repeat the question just to make sure everybody hears it. With Facebook ads with gift asks, we would be challenged to identify if a donor is new or existing based on the slim data provided by Facebook. Any tips? Now go, Matt.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think that there's a straightforward answer and then there's a complex answer. The straightforward one is a lot of times you do have to definitely use source code reporting and CRM reporting to make sure that you're relying on that. And so you're trying as much, what we used to do is manually take the CRM report of new donors by source and match that to our Facebook reports and put them together, honestly, manually. This is another example of where I thought actually the ad industry must have a solution for this, and it turned out that they don't. We ended up building sort of our own platform for reporting because there's just, nonprofit specific metrics like regular donors versus one-time donors, percent new, are just not really things that necessarily are automatically thought of in the industry, and especially in ads reporting. So there are some reporting systems that you can use central, but I think as a starting place, it's you have to combine your CRM reports with the Facebook reports.
And it's true, Matt mentioned that we, had to build our own reporting system. So M&R had built a reporting system called Scout. That's a proprietary reporting system that fixes some of the problems that happen when you're running ads. Even of not particularly complex ads program is hard to manage because there's so many metrics and vendors and places where you're holding data. So we built a program for it called Scout. Fixes what the ads world has not quite fixed yet. Okay, we are, I think, ready to go unless there's a last minute question skating in. A couple things. You will receive this presentation by recording. And so Liz at Thaler and Laura Clavon are our folks behind the scenes, along with Karen Hopper, who has been answering some questions and things here in the chat. We'll be sending you out a recording. Please, please, please feel free to always come to mrss.com and check out what we're saying on our blog. There's no obligation. It really is our enthusiasm for what we learn how to do and want to share with folks. We're all here for the same reasons. We want to make this world better for lots and lots of people, and these tools help us do it. And thinking through some of the more complex things like Facebook and privacy and ethics is part of what we're here on at M&R to do. So please feel free to check out our blog. Don't forget Mr. Benchmarks, April 21st. You can go to Mr. Benchmarks right now and sign up to be the first to get the very exciting data that's coming out this year. And finally, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Have a terrific day. Bye.